Good evening, everybody. I'm Kyle Bobiwash. I'm an assistant professor in entomology and the Indigenous scholar for the Faculty of Agricultural and Food Sciences at the University of Manitoba. I initially balked at coming to this, right? I'm an entomologist, right? Most of my work involves chasing bees on farms, in ditches, and a lot of the innovation that I do, sometimes results in what's the best toothbrush to mimic a bumblebee pollinating a blueberry flower. And, but I love criticizing. Oh, I love criticizing institutions. So I'll come along and participate here. And, I think it's important to think about, life sucks. Right, we're in a climate crisis. We're probably in a biodiversity crisis, probably in an economic crisis of some sort. Wealth inequality is at the highest it's ever been in a long time. Trust in science is low, right? Streaming services are through the roof in terms of subscription, right? But we know universities innovate, right? We like to think that as researchers, we're doing some sort of public good. I don't think there's any doubt about that. And I think something, though, that we forget to highlight is the fact that universities do more than just innovate through commercializing research, providing new tools to support civic functions, or even reconnect humanity with relationships with nature. Universities should be seen as this nexus for translating knowledge into tangible benefits that society sees, encompassing all sorts of metrics, right? We can think of economic metrics, whether they are market economics or human economics. But there are also places where we can actually question the system in which we innovate, right? And I think that's what universities have historically done really well. And we have to make sure that we think about innovation in that sense. And it's this broader conceptualization that it's this broader conceptualization of universities as these places where we can start to express human values in how we research and how we develop society. When we think of the role that universities play in innovation, we have to consider the broader impacts that universities have. Right? We have to think about the impact of creating just a scientifically literate society, not just driving science tools and innovations. It's also important to think about how to actually get people involved in the greater civil functions of society, whether that's Indigenous people, whether that's rural, we'll say country bumpkins like my mom, who will call herself that. She often doesn't see herself in the work that I do, even though it's really, I hope that is impacting the environment. And, I want to spend 1 second about thinking about how we create innovation and how we drive maybe our goals for innovation, right? We think the function that we should be providing is improving the world, making things a little bit better. But what that means is really different to a lot of people. Right? We can think about an Indigenous perspective of what makes the world better. Right? We can think of the history of Indigenous people. Almost think, oh my God, it's a history of displacement, not only from landscapes across Canada, but also from the civic responsibilities, the civic authority that you might have. Or we can, just think of it a little bit more pragmatic or conventional, so what actually matters to a lot of people. And it's usually some mix of one health metrics. It could be, the well-being of humans, the well-being of your environment, the well-being of animals in this system. And it's a mix. Everybody has a complex mix of all these indicators that allow them to kind of envision that future that's really good for them. So, maybe stepping out of the ivory teepee to really kind of think about what that drives in terms of my research project. As a pollination ecologist, I work primarily with bees, to some extent because I hate dealing with humans, but also because I think the question is somewhat easier to ask how I'm benefiting the world. A lot of my work is basically how do I valorize the function of bee species in a landscape? How do I put value on all that? You can say, oh, it's pretty easy, Kyle, right? We can think about their contributions to pollination. Oh, they drive food security. Oh, they create industry with their products, whether that be honey, pollen, propolis, things like that. That's great. But there's some garbage bees out there too. There's bees that don't do anything in the landscape. They're bad pollinators. They don't provide honey. They don't do anything for humans. maybe they have some function with maintaining, the natural ecosystem, those relationships, but it's really hard to think about what they do. If you're potentially creative enough, you can maybe think of them in a way to say, oh, maybe they drive future evolutionary relationships. They'll drive the future of what our systems look like long after humans are gone. Maybe that's the value that we can think about. But it's really hard to make that sound important to do. It's almost depressing to some extent. And the work that we try to do in terms of our research with science, whether that be entomology, whether that be agriculture, is also focused on understanding why people want to be involved in science and what they can get out of it. When it comes to work with Indigenous communities, it's making sure that we drive research processes that actually allow them to express their values, the values that they have about the environment, the values that they might have about politics or the economy onto those systems. It's making sure that we're doing conservation or agricultural development in a way that meets the standards of Indigenous communities and their knowledge systems. Our work with farmers when it comes to a SHRC-NSERC Sustainable Agricultural Research Initiative involves not only thinking about how to make agriculture more sustainable, but to understand what farmers themselves see as being sustainable. We have farmers that have all sorts of potential issues with, mental health, with HR recruitment, with being able to actually utilize any of our innovation. They also have a problem with the greater world not recognizing the fact that they've been at the forefront of making sure that their industry is as ecologically responsible as possible. But they actually don't often get a pat on the shoulder or this kind of respect that we give somebody like an ecologist or a climate scientist. Right? These people are at the ground floor in a lot of these spaces. And I think it's in these spaces that we're succeeding at least at the University of Manitoba and our faculty, where we're transforming that work. We're making sure that our tenure and promotion guidelines reflect those values, reflect the change that we're providing. We're expanding the boundaries and expanding the boxes that we allow people to innovate in their own disciplines. Thank you, miigwech, everybody.